for joining us tonight. Really looking forward to tonight's presentation. Tonight we are learning about tales of the wicked and weird in Massachusetts. We're joined by author and storyteller Roxie Zwicker for a fun evening of curious tales that shows New England has always had a quiet, weird side, even going back to its colonial days. Roxie will offer a look at some of the most unusual tales in her collection from eccentric people, odd omens, and superstitious silliness. We're going to review the old newspaper headlines and discover tales from every corner of New England that are creepy, unbelievable, and just plain weird, told with a dash of humor and wit. Tonight's talk is led by Roxie Zwicker, who's a best-selling local author and television personality. She has been featured on the Travel Channel and History Channel and has hosted the inspirational television series, The Power of One. Her company, New England Curiosities, features tours and events based on ghost stories of New England's forgotten past. Roxie, who has been sharing her stories of New England legends and lore for nearly 2 decades, is the author of over a dozen books, including Haunted Cemeteries of New England, Stones, Stories, and Superstitions, and also Haunted Pubs of New England, which is one of my favorites. So all 80 of us, let's give a big round of applause to Roxie for joining us here tonight. And Roxie, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's been such a wonderful relationship that I've had with the Tewksbury Public Library. I'm so glad we're able to work out this event for this evening. I really enjoy the audience and all the effort that goes into the programming. This is probably my 5th or maybe even 6th program with the Tewksbury Public Library. 6th. So I wish I could be there with all of you to see some of your familiar faces. Hopefully that will happen in the near future. I'm really excited to bring you some very unique stories tonight, ones that I typically don't have an occasion to tell. There are definitely some creepy ones in there, so I just want to forewarn you, there might be a couple that are definitely on the unsettling side. So we find that oftentimes truth is stranger than fiction. So I've tried to extract a couple of those and also a couple of humorous ones as well. I do have a tip for some of you that might be a little bit new to Zoom. There is a way for you to go full screen. So if you are seeing little boxes of people a la Hollywood squares, for those of us that are in my generation, all you have to do is just click on full screen. So that way you'll be able to see the full screen of everything that I'm trying to present. Because I will disappear in just a moment and I'm going to switch screens so you'll be able to see the images and stories that I want to share with you. So if you haven't gone full screen just yet, please make sure you go full screen or speaker view, as Robert just mentioned on the screen right there. It'll be a better experience for you, and that way you won't have to see me in a 3x3 square right there. So there may be some ghost stories in tonight's presentation, and all that I ask is, if you aren't a big believer in ghosts, just have an open mind. Tonight's presentation, I bothered to go ahead and actually extract some of the headlines to share with you as well. So you can really see that these were some of the stories that people were reading back in the day. Of course, when we get to the end, I always look forward to your questions. I know I've jam-packed a lot of information into tonight's presentation, so I'm super excited about that. And what I'm going to do now is pull back the curtain. I'm going to press the button, do a little share screen with you, and we'll step right into this evening's presentation. So I will see you in a few minutes, but you're going to see some stuff come up on your screen here. Through the magic of technology, let's see if we can get this all to work well for us this evening. This is always the moment of truth when I cross my fingers and hope that all of the efforts that have gone into tonight's presentation are working. I know I have here to make sure all goes well. All right. So tonight is Tales of the Wicked Weird in New England. You know, there are some really odd stories that are there and some very eccentric people in New England's history. And some of them that we're going to be talking about tonight, if I could bring you back in the England Curiosities time machine, I would go there with you. And we're going to start out with one of my very favorite stories. And it's actually kind of a stone's throw from where we would be in Tewksbury, just up the road a little ways. We're going to visit the Lady of Caskets. As you can see from the headlines here, wonder in life and mystery in death. Mrs. Dr. Frances Hillier, the Lady of the Caskets. Here you can actually see a photograph of Mrs. Hillier and her husband. And I think when it comes to eccentricities and a fascination with death, she would be my award-winning candidate, because there was no one who made more of a grand spectacle of herself in her front parlor when it came to death than Mrs. Hillier. So Wilmington, of course, as I mentioned, is just up the road a little ways, and she had this amazing fascination with death, and so much so that she allowed it to play out in her house in a very unusual manner. So let's take a look here at a little bit more detail from the story here. So December 22nd, 1889, this was the layout in the Boston Sunday Globe. So you can see all of these amazing illustrations right here that refer to these massive caskets. You can see that she had commissioned for her and her husband at the top of the screen right there. Now, these were no ordinary coffins. They were extravagant to every detail that you can think of. So it's really one of those very strange wonderments when you look at a little bit of the background of the Hilliers. So he was a doctor from Germany, and he had met Frances in London, England, and the two of them were married in 1868 and decided to settle in one of the suburbs of Boston. Dr. Hillier served a huge population, and he seemed to do very, very well at his trade. So much so, it often makes me wonder if they had more money than they may have known what to do with, because they built themselves a 14-room home, which was a spectacle in its own right, in addition to the coffins that you see here. There were large stained glass windows. Everything was imported from Europe. Even the staircase was quite dramatic to their home. It was carved into an alligator that had an open mouth. So can you imagine opening up the door to their house and being greeted by them standing there next to an open mouth alligator that was part of the staircase? So of course, Dr. Hillier was very interested, being Victorian times, in coming up with his own brand of medicines. And this is where things start to get a little bit weird. He had come up with this elixir that was supposed to cure anything that man or beast had an affliction from. It was supposed to be this revitalizer of youth and energy, almost bordering a little bit on, snake oil salesman, but we won't go that far. But it seemed to be a cure-all for everything. So meanwhile, while he is busy with his work, Mrs. Hillier, as I mentioned, had this huge fascination with death. And she had her coffin created while she was still alive. And one of her favorite things that she liked to do was to invite people over to the house while she posed in a dress in the living room in the coffin. She wanted people to come and visit her as if she was in the afterlife. She had diamond rings on every finger, even on her thumbs. She had these massive rings. And these tea parties that she had for the locals were definitely a spectacle. I mean, the highlight of it was her being, inside the coffin. Now, of course, there is a sad part to her story, and maybe that explains, why she had this huge fascination with death. Very, very sadly, she faced a lot of tragedies, and she had 23 children, and none of them survived. In fact, she had 7 sets of twins. Now, that is particularly heart-wrenching, considering her husband was a doctor and there was nothing that you could do, or that he could do to save them. So, of course, they were also into a movement we're going to talk about in another story in just a few minutes, about spiritualism. And they were very much into life after death, understanding, you know, all of what happens beyond the veil and the opportunity to come back from death. So this was an everyday occurrence for the family. So with that in mind, she had her burial robe made. It cost $20,000. It was shipped in from Europe. It was one of the most lavish things anybody had seen. And then, of course, came the time that she passed away. So we'll take a look at from the parlor to the grave now. So when she passed away, it was a very interesting occasion, because invitations had been sent out. The entire process of getting the coffin out of the house created quite a stir, because it actually had to be brought out through the window. It broke one of the railings on the house, and they had to actually move the wires that were alongside the road as the coffin was trying to make its way down. Now, if you want to see something really odd and spectacular outside of these drawings, let's take a look at the crowd that had assembled. So everybody had turned out. There's an image of the coffin coming over the railway out the parlor window. And again, it was absolutely huge. So next we find an actual photograph of the coffin. There it is on the left. Now, can you see the size of that compared to the truck that is just next to it? There were 4 black horses that were brought out that were completely draped in black. The trolley wires, like I said, had to be lifted up so the procession could go through the center of town. There were so many people trying to get a view of the scene that local authorities actually had to hold them back as this procession made its way. Now, where it was going, of course, to the local cemetery, you can see an illustration on the right-hand side of the tomb. Now, this tomb was just as elaborate as their house was. It was designed to let light in at a certain time of day. There was, again, some of that spiritualist belief in the ornamentation that was inside. I mean, anything that you can think of that was over the top inside this tomb as it related to death was really incredible. They had thought of everything from a carved snake coming out of a carved wooden head that was on the coffin to some of the other displays that were inside. So, of course, this was a very ostentatious display in the middle of the burial ground. And some years after their death in 1935, the town of Wilmington deemed it all an eyesore. And the tomb was actually dismantled. And they leveled the ground out. The mausoleum, this huge, you know, again, almost ghastly reminder of death, was taken down. The beautiful coffins that you see here were removed, and they were put in the ground with a simple planter and 2 brass nameplates. Not the grand eternal rest that the Hilliers had hoped for. But when it came to eccentricities, this is probably one of the biggest that I have heard of in my travels. Now, here is another story that, again, seems very sensational, but you'll actually find this in a few publications. The one that I'm sharing with you this evening came out on June 12th, 1890. Now, this is the story of a man who is known as the Storm Breeder. And it really seems like such an odd name for somebody. And it's about a man named Peter Rugg. He was from Boston. And he had a very strange young lady at his side who was his daughter. And this goes back to a lot of weather superstitions in New England, weather mythology, and of course, ghost stories. So this is where they all seem to intersect. Now, Is this story factual? Well, it was in several newspapers. Is it in myth? We know the man actually did exist. Does his ghost still make his way across the highways and byways of New England? We'll have to discover that. So let's take a closer look at the story of Peter Rugg and some of the most frightening weather episodes and some very unusual facts around them. So it all began one night soon after the Boston Massacre of 1770. Peter and his young daughter were trying to make it home from Concord, Massachusetts to Boston. And driving weather seemed to be quite the problem that night for them. So he was very urgent. He didn't want to wait the weather out. He wanted to get back to Boston. And he was the type of person that would not hesitate on using the whip on the horses to get to where he wanted to go. So, of course, it became quite stormy. Lightning was flashing, rain was falling, it got foggy, it was very difficult to see, and they were totally enveloped in this unrelenting storm. They kept going and going pretty much as far as they could, and finally they made it to West Cambridge. And there he stopped at a neighbor's house just to take a quick break from the storm, and the neighbor that he had known down the road said, you know, you probably should just stay here for the night. Don't try to complete the journey home. It's really bad right now. And all Peter Rugg did was he said, let the storm increase. He says, let it be a tempest. I'm going to find my way home no matter what. And of course, he ended up leaving out of the friend and neighbor's house rather abruptly, still had a little ways to go down the road, and he was going headlong into this nor'easter. Now, from some accounts, he actually did make that last stretch of road home, and some people say you could actually hear the horses going past the house, yet they never saw anybody because the storm was just so strong, and again, almost impossible conditions to see. So, of course, he made it home, but did he really? Because while people maintain they heard him go by, no one absolutely saw him over the next couple of days. And people wondered, did he really make it home, or did he meet with some sort of accident on the way home? Well, whatever the case was, there were some folks who were in one of the local taverns who had said that they clearly had seen him come close to the tavern and actually thought that he was going to stop. Well, eventually people stopped wondering about him, and as time went on, it seemed to be that he was still around in a way that some folks wondered, were they really seeing him, or were they just seeing his ghost? So next thing you know, out on the turnpike, out by Charleston, one of the toll takers, because these were toll roads, all of a sudden one evening swore that he saw Peter Rugg and his daughter coming along the stagecoach, coming up the road, not slowing down for the toll. In fact, he said as they got close to him, he stood out in front of them with a stool in his hand, yelling for him to stop, and he said he went right by him. He took the stool, threw it at Peter Rugg and the coach, and he claims that the stool went right through what he called an apparition. And he said he continued to watch it go up the road. Now, of course, he was also seen in Hartford. He was also seen in New Hampshire. And every time people saw him, the thing that they noted most about him was that the girl that was next to him, as the years went on, seemed to age, but Peter Rugg never did. And whenever he seemed to come through, even if it was a crystal clear day, beautiful blue skies, as soon as he had come through, some sort of wild storm had come up behind him. No one ever really knew what happened to Peter Rugg that stormy night. Some people believe that he's just along the road, maybe in what you would call a residual haunting or some sort of psychic impression still making his way along. Some people say that he is indeed the storm breeder, that he is there to let you know a horrifying storm is coming through. So I found this article to be very interesting. Again, it made its way to other newspapers. And again, there's, so many superstitions about New England weather, but the road that he is seen on most are the roads through Charleston and, of course, Cambridge, Concord, kind of the suburban Boston area. But again, his story also reached out to other communities in New England. So a great old story from the 18th century, and people are very superstitious about storms, so I'll leave it for you to decide. So this is a story that is very unbelievable, very weird, but sometimes when you go to some communities that choose to do things their own way, you have to say, wow, if that had happened in any other place than maybe Cape Cod, this may have been something that people would have stopped. So there was a certain way that they dealt with the widows on Cape Cod in the 18th century. So we're talking after the American Revolution. So picture Cape Cod, if you will. You have all of these sea captains going out to meet their fate on the ocean, sometimes not returning and leaving widows in their wake. Now, widows were a very interesting type of, I'm going to say it, commodity on Cape Cod, because they had use, they had worth, and they actually were bought and sold on the Cape. It was written that a very attractive widow had a good chance of being remarried within a couple of years after the disappearance of her husband or after the death of her husband. Well, if she wasn't married within the next couple of years and money started to run out, then all of a sudden they were brought to public auction. Can you imagine how incredibly humiliating that must have been? So in 1776, a woman known as Mistress Lovell was set up with a gentleman named Josiah Stevens for the sum of £9 and 6 shillings. According to record, she was auctioned 8 more times over the following years. And each year she grew, I hate to say again what the records say, but she grew less and less appealing. As she was getting older, they were working her harder and harder. She didn't have a lot of clothes. She was, basically working her fingers to the bone. So in 1782, she was in desperate need of some clothing. And the townspeople actually voted, it's on record, to vote for clothing for this woman, who essentially was almost a ward of the community. So she ended up, of course, getting this shirt, and quite sadly, in the following year of 1783, she had passed away. Now, around that same time frame, there was a woman that was known as Mistress Bumpus. Her name was Jane Bumpus, and she'd actually come from a very wealthy family. And the gentleman that she had been married to was from France and had come over, and after he died, she was immediately put up for auction because she was a little bit of an older woman, and she had quite an attitude. And as these events were unfolding, she would call, these people on their shameful practice. She wasn't one to keep her mouth shut. So the minister was summoned to come out and tell her to essentially act like a lady and to keep quiet. So she did, and she ended up being purchased at auction. It was said that she was from hardy stock, and she delighted in really taking care of the children of the families. And if there were any children that had become ill, she would sit with them as they struggled through things like smallpox and diphtheria. And she would matter if she got sick. It did not matter to her. She was there to serve the children. And of course, at that point, she really didn't put a lot of value on her existence. She believed that now she was, destined for this life of servitude. She also kept an eye on the people in town as to what they were doing as well. Remember, I said she was quite outspoken. And it just so happens that she noticed that they would be breaking certain little laws, like not keeping the Sabbath, which was a really big deal. You weren't supposed to go shopping or out and about. The Sabbath was that quiet, holy day. So, of course, she started calling after them, made quite a formal announcement about, these people who were doing what they shouldn't be doing, but yet were running the town the way that they had wanted. So very sadly, she ended up passing away a short time thereafter. And people didn't want to give her a proper burial. In fact, a lot of people just wanted to forget about her. So she was laid out in the local church. And as she was laid out, someone decided that, here's this poor woman, we should go and fashion a coffin for her. So the minister went, got the coffin, put her body in the coffin, nailed up the coffin. They were trying to figure out where to bury her. The minister left her in the church, and when he came back, the coffin was actually empty. Come to find out, 4 of the children that she had taken care of had opened up the coffin, removed her body, and ended up bringing her out into the woods, a little distance from the church. They constructed a little wooden cross that actually said, Mistress Jean Bumpus, wife of Sir Bumpus of France. And they carved it on the cross and gave her a burial. So it was actually the children that she had cared for over the years that took care of her in death. It was around 1800 that they stopped doing the widows, what they called a vendu down there, which was, again, selling the bereaved wives and widows. So a very odd and weird story indeed. All right, so let's take a look at this next story here. And this is one that has a lot of layers to it. It really makes me sad to tell this story because it also is in recent memory. I remember what had happened here. So I like to call this one, The Dead Have a Way of Haunting the Living. We're over in Newburyport, Massachusetts at Old Hill Burying Ground, which is a fabulous burying ground. If you have not gone, I highly recommend a visit to Old Hill. It dates back to about 1729. There's a lot of amazing gravestones that are there that have all sorts of stories on them. In fact, I do a virtual tour of Old Hill Burying Ground in Newburyport on occasion and just discovering the gravestones that are there. However, one of the amazing things about Old Hill Burying Ground is how it is becoming spread out all over parts of New England, because it was just a few years ago, a gentleman in Pepperell, Massachusetts was doing some digging in his yard and pulled out this gravestone. Now, Pepperell is not exactly down the road from Newburyport, and for whatever reason, they found this gravestone. They were able to trace it back to Old Hill Burying Ground, and they had no idea how it got into the backyard. So here you can see the gentleman from Public Works with the gravestone, and this was just, probably about 10 years ago that this had happened. So they ended up bringing the gravestone back, putting it on the hill somewhere near her grave. So that seemed to be interesting, but a couple of years after that, another piece of a gravestone was found. Luckily, this one was actually found in Newburyport. What's quite interesting about the gravestone itself is it tells us a little bit about how the person passed away. So this person, if you read the details on here, you can see that they were instantly destroyed about this accident that had happened amidst the rejoice for peace. So you can see this is from 1813, and they were celebrating the victory of the War of 1812, and a vehicle was going down the road and it ran over this small child who was 9 years old. And oddly enough, this gravestone ended up in this gentleman's backyard. Now, there are some thoughts that perhaps the gravestone carver ended up not using the stone and buried it in the ground. But there are also some thoughts in Newburyport that that gravestone really should have been up on Burial Hill, because according to records, that is where this child is buried. So a little bit of a mystery there as well. However, it is no mystery as to what is going on here on Burial Hill, on Old Hill. So here we have the Pierce tomb, and it's really right in the middle of the grounds. It's very easy to see, although there are a couple of trees on either side. This tomb is one that unspeakable things have been happening there, and it just really breaks my heart to tell you this story, but I'm hoping that maybe there'll be a word of warning for someone out there. So here, as I mentioned, we have the Pierce family, and the Pierce family died from tuberculosis. A lot of members between 1863 and 1899. Now, one of the things you can see is the door to it is all bricked up, and that is very recent brick. In 1925, vandals gained access to this tomb by digging out the side hill right there. They dug it out, managed to climb inside the tomb, and when they got inside, they opened up the coffins, removed the clothing from the corpses, they put them on and danced around the burial ground. The corpses were also sat up into seated positions, and they were poked with a stick. Now, finally, after all of these unspeakable acts that were done inside the tomb, a passersby saw the boys coming out of the tomb with some of the old clothing that obviously had been, you know, disintegrating and kind of rotting away there. So with that in mind, they alerted the authorities that something bad must have been going on, and police came over, took the clothing off the boys, put them back in onto the corpses, and sealed the tomb up. In 1985, the story was not over. Vandals broke into the same tomb again. This time, they set it up as a clubhouse, once again gaining access from the back of the tomb. They brought in alcohol and poured the alcohol into the corpse's mouth, took off all of the rotting clothing, and observed the alcohol pouring through what remained of the corpses. The caretaker to the burial ground found that the tomb had been broken into, alerted the police. Nobody had known who had done it until an appeal was actually printed in the newspaper on the front page. And they wanted people to come forward who had broken into the tomb because they needed to bring them to the hospital. And they said because they had disturbed a grave where people had died from contagious diseases. So oddly enough, with fear for their lives, 3 boys came forward. They were brought to the hospital and they were tested. Lucky for them, they hadn't caught anything. And once again, the tomb was sealed up. In 2005, the same tomb once again, a man who was doing court order community work in the burial ground decided to kick in the front entrance of the tomb. He twisted the skull off of one of the skeletons and posed for pictures with it. He showed the skull to other community service workers who immediately ran away from him. And when he was done playing with the skull, he kicked it down the hill where it rolled into an animal hole. Police could not identify the corpse or figure out, where the skull exactly went in there because everything had been disturbed in the previous break-ins that were there. So once again, the door was sealed up, and the man who had broken into the tomb, he just got an extension on his community service, unfortunately. This, of course, is the long view of the tomb, so you can see how people could dig behind the front of the tomb and not be seen, because we're right here at the top of the hill. Now, in 2005, when the tomb was open, and I remember this story quite well, they actually posted a photograph of what it looked like inside. And if you look carefully at this photograph, you can see there is clearly a couple of leg bones laying right there, not, in coffins, not on shelves, just on the ground. Now, people for years have claimed that the burial ground is haunted and that ghostly figures can be seen walking out of the front of the Pierce tomb. Some people have even claimed to have captured infrared photographs of ghosts walking from the tomb up and along the hill. But whatever you choose to believe, if you believe in ghosts, wonderful. What happened here is unspeakable. It's what they did in there was weird. I don't understand it, but hopefully the tomb will remain sealed for the remainder of the days. So we said wicked and weird. We have to tell you the story of these little wicked children. This is from the Boston Globe, August 28th, 1896. The headline was absolutely incredible. Ride in woods, chloroform, etc. Sensational story told by two children of the Highland District of their wanderings from home. So the Highland District is right where Roxbury is right now. So it kind of gets lumped into Boston. So we'll read this together because it's just so unbelievable. Alice and Charles Ferguson, aged 9 and 11 respectively, disappeared from their home, 25 Codman Park, Tuesday evening. They returned the following morning and gave a sensational account of their wandering. They said that they left their home to go picking blueberries in Blair's Woods, and that while in the woods, two men drove up in a wagon. The boy asked the men to give him and his sister a ride. The children told their parents that as soon as they got in, the men drove off at a great speed. The children became frightened and asked to get out, but they said the men refused to allow it. And the children further said that when they reached a dilapidated house on the outskirts of Dedham, the men put handkerchiefs wet with something over their faces and that they fell asleep. The little girl said that she awoke first and roused her brother. She said that the two men were lying close by with empty whiskey bottles by their side. The children said that they made their way to the railroad track and then made their way home. Oh, what a harrowing account. Can you imagine this story that they were out innocently picking blueberries and all of a sudden these two nasty men came along? Well, let's find out how this story ends. The police were notified of the affair by the parents of the children, and an investigation was begun. The police placed little credence in the story as told by the children, and that they were correct in their conclusions were proven this morning, when the boy Charles was brought into Station 9 and closely questioned. He denied the story previously told and said that they had no such adventure as they described. He said that they had reached the railroad station they mentioned by riding on wagons and walking, but no assault had been attempted by the driver of any wagon. The dirt and coal dust with which the children were covered were due to the fact that the two probably slept in a coal car, which was on a siding that night. So no mysterious strangers, no kidnapping, no chloroform, just a couple of little wicked kids out blueberry picking who stayed out after dark, climbed aboard the train, got dirty, fell asleep, and had to come home with some sort of story. So again, this is Boston Globe, August 28th, 1896. My thought is they probably weren't allowed to go blueberry picking after that for the foreseeable future. Can you imagine? All right, so I have a couple of stories here talking about your getting under my skin. So this is filed into the category of weird for sure, and also in my category of why. So James Allen, who is also known as George Walton, he was a very interesting character who was nothing but trouble. He was constantly robbing people, breaking into people's homes, creating havoc. Although he never killed anybody, he went from jail to jail all throughout the greater Boston area. And he was really quite, I would say, charismatic character from all senses, because wherever he went, he seemed to befriend some of the other prisoners and spoke very well of them, even though some of the other prisoners he was in with had killed people. He always seemed to be looking on the bright side of things. So, of course, as he was imprisoned in Boston after his last stint of robbery, he decided that maybe in some way this very interesting man, who was oftentimes referred to as the highwayman, that he should start putting together his life story. That it was that interesting. All of these people that he had met in his travels, all of the people that he had been imprisoned with. So he decided to tell the story to the jailkeeper, and the jailkeeper had promised to make sure that this diary would be printed. So as time went on, he went ahead with what was known as the deathbed confession. You can see a copy of the book here on the screen, which went into great detail about his life and how he was born into poverty, and he kind of took that as his right to level the playing field and make sure that he had enough money, and in some occasions gave people what they needed. So almost, a story of like a Robin Hood, robbing from the rich to give to the poor. So in his final days, when he was 30 years old, he contracted tuberculosis. And he decided that he really wanted to finish up this book, despite how sick he was. So here we have the final paragraph in the book, which is quite interesting. And it talks about, here is a man who, even though he lived this short life of 30 years, that maybe if he was someone who hadn't come up with a limited education and maybe with a little bit more means, that he really would have been much more useful in society. So you might think that's the end of the story. So we have this great diary. It's been published by the warden of the state prison. Very interesting read in its own right. However, here is a copy of the book. This is the cover on the left, and on the right is one of the end pages of the book. Now, it doesn't look like anything super special here. However, one of the deals that he made with the jailkeeper was that this book be bound in a piece of his skin. So 2 books were made with his skin from his back. It was tanned by a local tanner, and there you have the book. To his wishes, the diary also to his wishes. So we have these 2 mysterious books. Well, we know where one of them is, and should you have a grim curiosity, you can make an appointment to see it for yourself. It is at the Boston Athenaeum. So this is a newspaper article from the Boston Globe in 2007. And here you can see in the story, it tells about this book made from human skin. And of course, the thief named James Allen, who died in captivity in 1837, requested that his confessions be bound in this macabre fashion. Now, oddly enough, when you check with the Athenaeum about how they obtained this book, they actually don't have an answer. There's a few different answers as to how it may have come into their collection. but they don't have anything on the intake as to how it actually arrived. It could have come from a granddaughter, it could have come from someone else, but we know where it is now. So if you are interested in taking a look at it, make an appointment. I'll bring you back and show it to you one more time. There it is. And that's, of course, all about his name in Latin on the cover of the book right there. All right, so let's continue to talk about things that get underneath our skin. And I decided to pull this story from Tewksbury. And for those of you in Tewksbury, you might actually know this story, but I thought it was also worthy of mentioning because, again, it's weird and very unthinkable. So Tewksbury had an asylum back in its day, and it still stands. And of course, there was a time when asylums were not the places that you would want to end up. Initially, they were designed to be places of rest and recuperation and of healing. There was a whole notion that getting some fresh air, being in an environment where people were caring for you might be helpful. And this is a very sad but true story. And there's a lot of documentation on this. I'm not going to go into it in super great detail because we don't have as much time as I think the story warrants, but I definitely did want to go ahead and mention this. So let's take a look a little bit closer here. So this is known as depending on what you read, the Tewksbury Almshouse. I've also read it being referred to as an asylum. It all depends on the time frame of the newspaper that you're reading, and I'm going to show you a couple of clips in just a minute. So things were happening that were getting the attention of the authorities inside this institution. And some of the stories were really atrocities that you would find in other institutions throughout that time frame of the late 1800s and going into the early 1900s across the country. It was, sad, horrid, squalid conditions. There was the whole notion of things being stolen from some of the people that were patients there. In addition, they weren't being fed. There was a lot of awful things happening there. And some of the things that were being sent to the almshouse weren't being used. In fact, they were sent a certain amount of coal, and the coal was being sent up to Exeter, New Hampshire, being sold at a profit. So everything was being mismanaged here. And there were stories about the dead bodies of babies who were being sold to medical institutions. There was a lot that was going on that was really awful. So it started with this article that I had first found. So here you see the Boston Globe, May 10th, 1883, and the horrifying headline, Tanning Human Skin. Testimony in Tewksbury investigation yesterday, and it goes on to actually reprint all of the questions and answers that you have here. And one passage in particular was very frightening. So here in grave detail, you can read the testimony of this gentleman who worked in a local tanning shop, and he was tanning skins of the people that had died in the almshouse that were being sent to him. And he goes into a little bit of detail about how he kind of knew, but wasn't really 100% sure. He's like, well, I believe, and they're asking him how many, and he goes into what he felt his job was. He was doing what he was told, and it was days and days of this testimony hitting the newspaper about what was going on there. Just again, everything from making rugs from the dresses of people who were staying there, taking all of their things, and then again this. So when this finally played out in court, finally something was done about it, and everybody was removed from their positions. The abuse ended, but what had gone on over that span of a few years was absolutely horrifying. So let's brighten it up a little bit with a ghost ship story. So we're going to go between Essex and Gloucester, Massachusetts, for the story of the ship, the Charles Haskell. Now, this is a really fantastic story. It makes its way into the newspapers in Gloucester every now and again. You may have seen it, but if
Can you hear me, Roxie? I think we may have lost Roxie, folks. Hopefully this is momentarily. Let's see. I'm trying to get in touch with Roxie. Hmm. Stop share. So Roxie, can you hear us? So Roxie is still on the call. Not sure. Let's see. I'm going to call Roxie on the phone, folks. Just this talk is haunted. I think you're right, Heather. Just give me a minute or two here. I'll get in touch with Roxie. So folks, I had to leave a message. Roxy's not picking up. I hope she didn't lose power or something like that. I instructed her to leave the meeting, which it looks like she may have just done. Let me see if I can find Roxy on the. All right, so she's left the meeting. Hopefully she's going to rejoin the meeting. So we'll give it another minute or two. Yes. Oh, good. Several librarians in the audience. That's nice. And yes, here she comes. I didn't doubt her for a second. Here comes Roxy. Okay. We'll blame it on one of the ghosts. Let's see. Where is she now? I think she shows up at the very end. There she is.
Hello.
Hey, Roxy. Sorry about that. Not sure what happened.
That's okay.
Okay, you should be able to share your screen again.
Okay.
And I think you're on your last story or second to last story. I know we're almost at the end here.
Yep, we were. All right. Let me let me go back.
You know how you're doing a good job, Roxy. Only 2 or 3 people dropped off the call, so that's a good sign. So thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for everyone being understanding.
I appreciate that. I'm popping right back in now. Give me 2 seconds. So we were talking about the Charles Haskell, how it had gotten into a collision with the Andrew Johnson out at sea, and it was believed that the ship was cursed when it made its way back to Gloucester. They left it at the dock and never sailed it again. So as we get nearer to the end, we're almost done. Let me come back here. One more screen. I touched it one too many times. May 17th, 1896, one final print. This was a story that was in the Boston Globe about a printmaker who was at the printing press, and he noticed that his coworker had come in overnight to do some printing, and it was not his typical shift. So he yelled over to him, what are you doing here tonight? And he's like, I have to make this one final print. And he's like, well, what's the story? What's the big deal? And come to find out, that final print that he was putting out was for Samuel J. Wall, age 39 years old, 4 months and 3 days. Philadelphia papers, please copy. And he printed that in the obituaries. Now you might think, wow, did he know somebody was on his deathbed? Was somebody sick? What had happened? Well, come to find out, the printmaker right there, that man who had come in that wasn't supposed to be working, was actually Samuel Wall. So the gentleman that was there that saw him come in and saw him print his own obituary could not believe his eyes. He's like, why would you print something like that? And allegedly he had passed in the night and came in to make sure that his obituary would have been printed. And the reason why he listed the Philadelphia papers to copy was because he was originally from Philadelphia. So the ghost printed his own obituary. All right, so I told you we had another story of spiritualism as we start to wrap up tonight. So the spiritualist at work, devoted to the best interests of humanity and progression here and hereafter. This is a fabulous story of a woman who was much beloved spiritualist. And this story was in the Springfield Republican. Her name was Miss Hattie Eager. And she had seemed to have tried to talk to everybody about their spirits on the other side. Well, come to find out, one day she ended up predicting her own death. And people could not believe the story, that all of a sudden she predicted she was going to die one day, and she died that exact day and that exact time. The story was so incredibly unbelievable, so much so that some of the doctors in town decided that they were going to get their hands on her corpse. And come to find out, she had actually taken poison at the hour she had predicted. So she committed suicide, but she did not want to lose her reputation of being a spiritualist. And when we look behind the scenes here, behind the curtain, as it were, you can actually see these were masks that were used by charlatan spiritualists back in the day. She had been spurned by a gentleman. Business was dropping off for her. She wasn't feeling as wonderful about things as she once did. So she wanted to go out in a grand way by predicting her own death, and come to find out, the doctors revealed she had actually committed suicide. All right, so you can find me at Roxie ZW on Instagram. You can also find me on Facebook at England Curiosities. It's so hard to try and cram all in such a short period of time and do them all. So there's all information. What I'm going to do is come back on the screen. I don't know why we had an issue this evening, but I apologize, and thank you all for sticking with me tonight. Here I am back, and I will check with you, Robert, to see if there were any questions that I could answer, or any commentary or anything like that.
Absolutely, this was nothing compared to trying to do a Zoom on Tuesday night during a tropical storm and tornado warning. Tom, the speaker, was from Connecticut, so we were having lots of fun that night. This was a piece of cake. So, so I guess one of the first comments was actually for me. I just wanted you to know, Roxie, and you probably had read this, that there are some people who think that Mrs. Hiller is the market basket ghost. So I don't know if you... Don't know if you heard that up in New Hampshire, but Wilmington's Market Basket location is supposedly haunted by a ghost, and people are connecting that with Mrs. Hiller. Victoria says, I was wondering if all Mrs. Hiller's 23 children were buried there as well, with much elaboration.
There was nothing written in the records that I could find. I know the Historical Society has some information about her too, but nothing that I could find about where her children are buried. And again, there were multiple sets of twins. So sometimes when children were buried, they were buried without ceremony as well. So I'm not 100% sure where they are. I cannot find that information, but that's a great question. I'd love to know the answer to.
And Deb asks, to your knowledge, are there any descendants of the Hillers left in the area?
There are none that I can find.
Let's see. And I'm going to mix the stories up, so I'm not even going to attempt to remember. So I'm just going to say the question, and hopefully you know the context.
I'll try.
Judy wants to know, was Peter's daughter ever seen?
Peter's daughter was, when she was seen, she had gotten older, and every story following, so in sequence, every time they saw her, she had gotten older and older and older in every instance of the carriage being seen, which really made the story very intriguing. Was she aging as a ghost? Was she aging as a person? What had really happened there? So the two of them disappeared, but when they kept appearing, she was older and older every single time.
Great. Then we have lots of comments with people just, angry with some of the folks in one of your stories. Then we lost you for a few minutes, and people were trying to make me feel better. Heidi wants to know, were windows auctioned off any other places besides the Cape? Widows.
Yeah. The only place I've ever found it was on the Cape. Again, they called it the Widow's Venue, but that's notwithstanding that there were other almshouses where you had to essentially work to live there. Portsmouth, where I do my tours, the almshouse were stories of that, where you would be hired out to do some work for somebody. So that almost could be construed as an auction, but in that sense, it was a true auction. And all I really found on that was on the Cape for about 40 years.
Karen made a joke about the masks. Lori says, fantastic stories. Sandy says, awesome talk. Amy says, thank you for sharing such interesting stories. Betty McMahon says, great stories, thank you. Lisa says, thank you, Roxie. Lori says, thank you, Roxie. Judy says, thanks for more great stories, Roxie. Kelly mentioned that she was also having technical difficulties. So Kelly, I did record. Am I still recording? Yes. So, oh, this is going to be an ugly recording, but I captured everything, including the technical difficulties, and I will send anyone who signed up tonight. There was a few folks that couldn't make it, but signed up. I will send out the link tomorrow morning with the survey, so you can see what you missed. You can click on that recording link. Rebecca says, thank you so much. Victoria says, love this, thank you. Heather, wonderful, I loved every second. Michelle said, so fun, thank you. And Judith said, thank you. Clearly, Roxie, your fan club has shown up tonight. Diane has a comment, Bumpus comes from the name Bunpass. Some live in Wareham, apparently.
Oh, fantastic. Their family originated in France. I love it.
Here we go. Let's see, we'll wrap up in a minute or two. If anyone has any last minute questions, get them into the chat. We'll try to wrap by 8:15. Lori says, these are terrific, great series. And as I said, Lori, we're gonna have more paranormal talks in October, so look for those. Please give me some names, recommendations in the feedback survey tomorrow morning. Let's see, I don't see any more questions coming in. Speak of the devil. Okay, here comes Joyce. What's the best way to research residents of almshouses in New Hampshire? Wow, can you answer that one? That's a librarian question. What do you say, Roxie?
That's a really good question. So if you are looking at Portsmouth, I can tell you can go to the Portsmouth Athenaeum. Concord, New Hampshire, they have extensive records because the buildings, some of them are still being used, and they just marked their cemetery a few years ago. So I know those two localities have enough information where you can get some names and some information. The problem with a lot of them is records are locked unless you're family, because they were under the care of the state. But if you start with, gosh, I'm trying to think, I mean, even just going to the New Hampshire Historical Society, which is very active and has a lot of information, just checking with them, because they have a lot of records too when these places close that are sent over to them, might be an avenue for you as well.
And Joyce, just so you know, the Tewksbury Library is starting a genealogy club. We're going to be meeting I don't want to get this wrong, but I believe we're going to be meeting the third Tuesday night of the month at 7 o'clock, and we'll be meeting via Zoom for the foreseeable future. And each meeting will feature a special expert guest. So perhaps if you're free on Tuesday nights, you can come to a future meeting and get that question answered. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so Roxie, any last words for the group before we officially wrap up?
I really appreciate you all taking the time out and having patience this evening. Like I said, I much prefer to be there with you guys, but you know, go ahead and do some explorations. If you can go ahead even online and do some research through your library, there's a ton of stories that are out there that never see the light of day. That was my focus tonight. But you can connect with me on Facebook. I have tons of things that I'm doing on there all the time. Like I said, Instagram as well. Hopefully in the future, I'll be back in Tewksbury again. And I really just appreciate you all being here so much.
Great. So thank you so much, Roxie. Really want to thank you too for including the Wilmington and Tewksbury stories. It was nice to have some local pieces in there. So a reminder, folks, check for that email tomorrow morning, fill out that feedback survey. It would be greatly appreciated. Roxie did a wonderful job. Let's give her a big virtual round of applause. And Roxie, we'll definitely see you at some point, I'm sure, in the not so distant future. So thanks again, Roxie. Thank you all. I'm going to end the meeting in about 15 seconds. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Everyone stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again, Roxie. I'll be in touch.
Thanks, Robert.